"You touch that piano, old man, and I'll throw you out myself." That's how it began, an insult hurled across a noisy city market toward a stranger in a weathered coat. But when the man sat at the abandoned broken piano and played a melody no one had heard in decades, the entire crowd went silent. Phones dropped, conversations stopped, tears fell. What they didn't know was that he was once one of the most celebrated composers in the world. A billionaire who vanished after a fire claimed his wife and his voice. This is the story of how one haunting song cracked open a city's heart, unraveled a decade of silence, and sparked a worldwide movement of healing, music, and legacy. It's about a man who stopped playing until the world needed him to remember, and a note that never truly ended. Now, before we dive deeper, please like and subscribe to our channel. We share powerful, meaningful stories like this every day. And drop a comment below to let us know what time and where you're watching from. Thank you so much. And now, let's get back to the story. "You touch that piano, and I swear, old man, I'll throw you out myself." The voice came sharp from behind a stall lined with lopsided oranges, the kind that bruised if you so much as looked at them too long. A butcher's apron flapped like a banner in the spring breeze as the speaker stepped forward, wiping bloodied hands on his thighs, more out of habit than purpose. The man he spoke to didn't flinch, didn't even blink. He stood quietly in front of the old upright piano, like it was a gravestone, something mourned and long forgotten. The marketplace buzzed around them, loud with the usual racket. Vendors hawking, children chasing after candy wrappers, teenagers loitering like they owned the place, and the distant echo of a saxophone 2 blocks away, failing to find a melody. But here, at the corner where Jackson Street met a sun-bleached mural of forgotten civil rights leaders, the world paused. The piano was the reason. It was a sad-looking thing, once black, now chipped down to a tired gray. A few of its keys were missing altogether. Others stuck when pressed. The wood bore the scorched memory of something that had tried to devour it whole. Fire, maybe, or time. Someone had scrawled across the top in black Sharpie, "Do not touch, broken." No one had touched it in years, until now. The man was older, though how old, no one could say. His posture betrayed youth once carried and lost. His clothes were simple but worn with dignity. A navy coat that had seen better days, trousers a little too loose, shoes scuffed at the toes. His hands, tanned, veined, elegant, rested quietly at his sides. His eyes were hidden behind sunglasses, but his face looked as though he remembered too much. The kind of remembering that didn't let you sleep. "Sir," the butcher pressed again, stepping closer, tone now laced with irritation and something less nameable, nervousness perhaps. "You can't just—" But the man didn't hear him, or maybe he did, and chose silence. A girl, no more than 8, tugged at her mother's sleeve near the flower stall across the aisle. "Mama, is he gonna play it?" she asked, her eyes wide beneath the brim of her yellow sun hat. Her mother hushed her, though she too was staring now. The man reached out. Just the motion of his hand, a slow, deliberate stretch, seemed to hush the noise of the market by a decibel. His fingers hovered above the cracked ivory, as though asking permission from ghosts who'd once loved this place. There was no ceremony to it, no theatrics, just a quiet, aching reverence. The moment before contact lingered, delicate as glass. A young man holding a crate of ripe mangoes laughed and shouted, "Betty plays chopsticks and calls it jazz." There were chuckles. Small ones. The kind that bloom when people are unsure whether to be amused or embarrassed. Still, the man didn't move. Not yet. Someone in the crowd muttered, "I heard it burned down with the conservatory next door. Nothing left but smoke and a stack of ruined sheet music." A breeze rustled through the alley, bringing with it the scent of cilantro and asphalt, and for a moment the man's chin tilted upward, just slightly, as if tasting the memory in the air. And then he sat. The movement was fluid, familiar, like an old coat worn for the first time in years. A breath seemed to pass through the onlookers, almost involuntarily, as if their lungs had all agreed to hold still. He placed his hands on the keys. A heartbeat passed, then another, and then nothing. No sound. He simply sat there, touching the piano like it was a relic, his fingers resting on notes too fractured to sing. A woman whispered to her friend, "Maybe he's just crazy." But the little girl in the sun hat said, "He's listening." To what? No one could say. The man's left pinky trembled slightly, his lips moved as if mouthing a prayer. And then, without warning, a single low note emerged, deep and sorrowful like a bell rung beneath the sea. It wasn't clean, it wasn't even in tune, but it was alive. The marketplace stilled. One by one, heads turned. Fruit stopped exchanging hands. Transactions paused. The air changed, not colder or warmer, but heavier, like the sky itself had taken notice. He pressed another tea. Then another. The melody was fractured at first, hesitant, like a child remembering a lullaby, but there was something beneath it. A shape. A soul. The butcher, once ready to throw the man out, stepped back, a flush rising to his cheeks. The girl in the sun hat sat down cross-legged on the pavement, jaw slack, forgetting her melting ice cream. Within moments, the melody formed something whole. Not a song anyone could name, not a cover, not a pop tune, but something older, original. The music breathed grief and longing, love and memory. The notes wrapped around people's hearts like fingers, not demanding attention but deserving it. A breeze swept through the market again, and the tattered awning over Rosa's tacos fluttered violently, as if trying to join the rhythm. People began to gather, pulled as if by gravity. A woman in scrubs wiped a tear before she even realized she was crying. A group of teenage boys, initially recording to mock, now stood frozen, phones lowered. The music grew, not in volume but in depth. It was a river running through their chests. It was a confession, wordless and profound. No one knew the man, but no one could look away. And as the sun broke through a patch of clouds, a stray beam fell right on the piano, catching on the man's silvering hair, his closed eyes, his moving hands. In that light, he didn't look homeless. He didn't even look ordinary. He looked like someone who had once carried the whole world on his back, and was, for just a moment, allowing himself to remember how it sounded when it broke. He played for no one, and for everyone. He played like he had made the piano with his own two hands, like every note came from a place he had buried deep long ago. And the market, for the first time in decades, fell completely, utterly silent. The melody floated through the air like fog over a lake, quiet at first, but with a gravity that curled around every person, every memory, every wound they had long buried. Somewhere between the third and fourth chord, an old man dropped the plum he was about to weigh. It rolled toward the gutter, unnoticed. He didn't blink. His eyes were misted over, mouth parted, like he was hearing something not with his ears, but with something much older inside him. The music had no name. Not one the crowd knew anyway. It wasn't classical or jazz or even blues. And yet, it felt like all of them at once. As if someone had taken longing and folded it into notes, wrapped regret in minor chords, and let them loose on keys long dismissed as dead. A young mother holding her baby stood motionless, the child quiet against her chest, lulled by something softer than sleep and deeper than a lullaby. The baby stirred once, then sighed, his tiny breath joining the hush that had spread like wildfire through the square. And then, "My God," a voice whispered. "That's David's song." It was barely audible, but heads turned toward it, as though the crowd were moving on strings. The voice belonged to an elderly woman standing near a flower cart. She looked out of place among the riot of colors, dressed in gray with a brooch pinned to her coat and a trembling in her jaw. Her hands clutched a bouquet of white chrysanthemums, fresh but suddenly forgotten. "That's my husband's song," she said again, louder now, eyes wide with something between recognition and disbelief. He wrote that. People began looking at her now. Vendors, shoppers, the young girl in the yellow sun hat, everyone. But the woman saw none of them. She stepped forward slowly, like the melody itself was pulling her. Her voice caught in her throat. It was never finished. No one dared interrupt her. She reached the edge of the semicircle, forming around the piano, and simply stood there, tears beginning to trace down the folds of her face. "He wrote it for me," she murmured almost to herself. "After the fire, he never played again. But he left the sheet music beside my bed. It had no ending." The man at the piano never looked up. His fingers danced now, not hurried, but sure. As if the music wasn't being composed, but remembered. As if every note had been waiting inside him for years, growing older with him. And now, finally, they were free. The woman gasped softly. "That's the ending. Oh my God, that's what he meant to write." She covered her mouth as if to catch the years spilling from it. A younger man, her son, perhaps, appeared behind her and placed a hand on her shoulder, but she didn't seem to notice. Her heart was breaking in real time. And healing too. Somewhere off to the left, a boy with headphones dangling from his neck muttered, "How would he know that? How the hell would he know that?" And yet no one could argue. It was her husband's song. There was something eerie about the way the music threaded into their memories, as if the melody wasn't new but ancient, as if it had been written into the walls of the market itself, like a secret waiting for someone brave enough to play it. The violinist who'd stood on the corner earlier now walked toward the piano, bow in hand, completely forgotten by his own street corner. He looked lost, or found. He stared at the pianist's hands with a reverence usually reserved for saints or ghosts. "I studied at the conservatory," he whispered to no one, "before the fire, before it all went dark." Another man, middle-aged, suited, face ashen, approached slowly from the back of the crowd. His lips moved silently, counting, matching the chord changes. "I haven't heard that technique since," he trailed off. "No, it can't be." Whispers began fluttering through the crowd now. "Who is he? Wasn't there a pianist who disappeared years ago? Lucas something? Lucas Harrington?" The name struck like a crack of thunder. People exchanged looks. The child in the sun hat tugged her mother's sleeve again. "Mama, who's Lucas?" Her mother knelt beside her, tears in her eyes. "He was a musician, a genius. He built the conservatory that used to stand here. Until the fire took everything." "And his wife," someone else said from behind them. "Yes," the woman nodded. "His wife died in the fire. He was never seen again after that. They said he left the country, or went mad. No one ever knew. But this is her song." The crowd turned again, as if hoping the music itself would confess the truth. Still, the man at the piano did not lift his head. And yet the way he played, it wasn't just talent. It was identity. His hands moved like they belonged to the melody, like his very body had been carved around it. The notes swelled now, growing not louder but fuller, each one threaded with something unspoken. And the final movement of the piece began to form, deliberate and transcendent, building toward something no one had expected but somehow always needed. A boy with freckles whispered, "He's playing her back to life." And in a way, it was true. The piano, once broken and left to decay in the open air, now trembled with the weight of the past. It cried with sorrow. It bled with grace. It rose with hope. And the crowd, once chaotic, distracted, ordinary, stood still in reverence, all of them caught in something too big to name. The melody hit its climax and then drifted downward, like a feather falling through a storm. Slower, softer, until it paused, a rest, a silence. Then, just before the final note, a breeze moved through the market once more. This time it didn't bring noise or dust or noise from the subway beneath. It brought something else. Closure. The man's hands settled gently on the last key. It was not loud, not dramatic, just right. A sigh left his lips as though he'd been holding it for years. He sat still for a moment, hands resting, the music now lingering only in the bones of the people who had heard it. And then, quietly, he rose. He did not speak. He did not bow. He simply turned from the piano, nodding once to the grieving woman who clutched chrysanthemums like a lifeline, and walked slowly down the alleyway, coat fluttering behind him, vanishing into shadow as gently as he had come. The crowd didn't chase him. They couldn't. No one dared move. Even the market, long known for its shouting and haggling, its hot tempers and cheap joy, didn't resume. Not yet. Because something sacred had just passed through. And none of them wanted to be the first to break the silence. The first sound to break the silence was the soft, unmistakable click of phone camera shutter. And then another. And then another. It wasn't sudden. It was shy at first, reverent. But the magic had already bled from the air, and once the spell broke, reality began seeping back in. The sounds of rustling clothes, quiet breaths, whispers like wind between ruins. People turned to one another with questions in their eyes and stories already forming on their lips. Did you feel that? Was that really her song? Was he really who we think he was? But the man, the pianist, the ghost, the miracle, was gone. By the time someone thought to follow, to chase, to find where he had disappeared to, the alleyway behind the market was already empty. The shadows had folded over the bricks like a curtain drawn tight, and the only thing left behind was the echo of his final note. Still, people didn't scatter. Not immediately. They lingered like mourners at a gravesite, unwilling to leave first, uncertain of what to do with what they had just witnessed. The woman with the chrysanthemums stood trembling, whispering to herself as tears streaked down her cheeks and into the petals. He finished it. After all this time, he remembered. Her son stood beside her, phone in hand, still recording though the video had long outlasted the performance. He didn't know why. Maybe he didn't want to lose it. Maybe part of him thought the man might return. He wouldn't. But the world, unbeknownst to them, was already starting to pull the thread. One video, then 2, then 20. It began with a teenage girl who'd been filming from behind the fruit stand. She uploaded the clip with the caption, "Who is this man?" Just silenced our entire market with a song I've never heard but somehow knew, Ghost Pianist. Within minutes, the algorithm took notice. Some watched it for the melody, others were drawn by the emotional weight in the crowd's faces, the silence, the stillness. Something about the video felt like a prayer, or a secret, or both. The comments began filling in. He's not just playing, he's speaking through music. I don't know what I'm crying for, but I can't stop. That melody feels like grief and healing had a child. It spread from local feeds to international ones. A viral music account reposted it. Then an orchestra conductor, then a journalist who recognized the square and began asking questions. Theories came fast and fierce. He's a street performer. No, he's a grieving widower. Maybe he's just a musical savant, someone who wandered in from nowhere. But then came the thread that changed everything. A grainy zoom in, a pause at the hands, a screen cap of his face, partially obscured but unmistakable to anyone who had followed classical music a decade ago. Lucas Harrington, a name that hadn't trended in 10 years. A name that once held weight in symphony halls and foundation boardrooms, in music academies and philanthropic circles. The billionaire heir who had walked away from his fortune after the fire that killed his wife. The composer who vanished. Rumors said he'd gone mad. Others said he died quietly in some cabin in Norway, alone with his memories. But now, this video, this market, this melody. The signs were too precise, the hand movements, the composition style, the emotion so raw it seemed to rupture the screen. It couldn't be coincidence. The internet began to whisper what the crowd had already suspected. He's back. By the time the sun dipped below the skyline and lights flickered to life across the city, the entire world was watching a 67-second clip of a man in a worn navy coat playing an abandoned piano in an open-air market. The video had surpassed 2 million views. But in the market itself, hours before that number hit 6 million, something quieter unfolded. A woman named Arya, who had once been a student at the now-destroyed Harrington Conservatory, returned to the square. She brought with her a worn folder of sheet music, water-damaged and creased. She didn't speak. She simply sat beside the piano, now surrounded by flowers and candles, placed by strangers who didn't know the man but had felt his pain. She opened the folder and began playing from the pages, fingers trembling. It wasn't perfect. She had grown rusty over the years, like the piano itself. But, note by note, she pieced together the original melody, the one David had written for his wife, the one never finished. And what she discovered chilled her. The ending, the very notes the mysterious man had played hours earlier, weren't on the sheet. They had never been written, they had never existed on paper, and yet he had played them, exactly. As if the song had always lived inside him. As if he had known it not from ink, but from memory. She stopped playing, her voice caught as she whispered, "Only one other person knew this piece, and he never wrote the ending down." Someone standing nearby asked quietly, "Are you saying?" She looked up, face pale. "I studied under him. I would know his phrasing anywhere." The candles flickered. The piano groaned softly in the wind. And then, almost like a whisper, someone placed a small card on top of the keys. It read, "The music we forget still remembers us." No name, no signature, just a message. And by the next morning the flowers had doubled. The vendors came back, but they didn't shout. They unpacked their fruits and spices and textiles in near silence, like they were setting up in a sacred place. The piano stayed. So did the memory. And in a quiet hotel room 10 blocks away, a man sat alone by a window, staring out at a city that no longer knew him, yet suddenly remembered who he was. His coat lay across a chair. A photo of a woman with kind eyes rested near the nightstand. He didn't smile, but there was something in his face now that hadn't been there in years. A sense that something long broken had finally, however briefly, been whole again. He reached for a notebook, opened it, and began writing a new composition. No title, no key signature, just notes that poured out like rain after a drought. Because he knew, now, there would be more to say. And the world, ready or not, was beginning to listen. The knock came softly, like someone was afraid the sound itself might hurt him. Lucas didn't move. He sat by the window, bathed in early morning light that turned his skin to porcelain and dusted silver across the lines of his face. The city outside was stirring, delivery trucks rumbling, horns offering their impatient greetings, and pigeons fighting over crumbs on the ledge below. The world, as always, kept turning. But inside room 703, time remained still. The knock came again. 3 polite taps. He closed the leather-bound notebook he'd been writing in and let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Then he stood slowly, stretching joints that hadn't been asked to move much in years. When he opened the door, he didn't speak. Neither did the woman standing on the other side. She was older now, her hair streaked with gray, her posture rigid from years behind a desk, but her eyes were unmistakable. They had once looked at him from across mahogany tables in the Harrington Foundation boardroom, had once studied his compositions like scripture, had once mourned beside him when the ashes of his conservatory still smoldered in the rain. "Alice," he said quietly, the name tasting like something long buried. She nodded once, then stepped forward and embraced him. Not tightly. Just long enough for the silence between them to mean something. When they sat, she didn't comment on the plainness of the room. She didn't question the modest coffee pot or the frayed curtain string. Instead, she placed a phone on the table between them and turned the screen toward him. The video played without sound, but he didn't need it. He watched himself, older, stooped slightly, wearing the same coat he now hung on the back of the chair, sitting at the broken piano. He watched the moment his hands began to move, the market going still, the woman crying, the final note. And he watched it not as a performer, but as someone watching a stranger hold their own grief in public. When the clip ended, Alice said nothing at first, just let the silence sit. Then, softly, "You've gone viral in 17 countries. The clip's at 40 million views as of this morning. Music historians are dissecting the phrasing. Pianists are recreating it note for note. Half the classical community is arguing whether you're dead or a ghost or an imposter." Lucas stared out the window again. "Let them." Alice studied him for a long moment. Then she said, "You were never meant to vanish. You still have things to give." He turned sharply to her, not angry, just raw. "I gave everything, Alice, you know that. I gave it all to her, to the school, to the students. When the fire took her, I had nothing left. You still had music." His voice cracked. "That, not without her." For a long time, neither of them spoke. And then, as if reaching across time itself, Alice placed a folded letter on the table. Its paper was brittle, stained at the edges. She pushed it toward him with a trembling hand. "I was supposed to give this to you," Hughes whispered. "She left it with me. Told me to wait, that you'd come back when you were ready." He didn't move, but the letter called to him like the piano had, like the past had. He reached for it slowly, the way a man reaches for a wound. When he unfolded it, her handwriting hit him like a chord unresolved. "My love, if you're reading this, then I didn't make it, and that thought breaks me more than any flame could. But please don't let it break you too. You always told me that your music came from me, that without me there would be no song left in you. But my darling, you were the song long before I ever came along. I was just lucky enough to dance in its echo. If grief becomes your silence, let memory become your voice. Play again. Not because you owe it to the world, but because I'll be listening. Always." His hands trembled. The ink blurred as tears filled his eyes. For a moment, he felt the weight of every year since she'd gone press against his chest like a cathedral ceiling. Alice reached out, gently covering his hand. "She believed in you," she said quietly, "and so do I." He wiped at his face with the back of his sleeve and let out a slow, breaking sigh. "You know they'll come now," he murmured. "Reporters, photographers, journalists chasing a headline." She nodded. "They already are. Some are camped at the market, others are knocking on the doors of your foundation board. The mayor's office called me this morning. They want to name the piano square after you. Lucas gave a hollow laugh. The same city that let the conservatory rot? She gave a small smile. Yes, the same one. They remember now. You brought something back. I wasn't trying to. Maybe not. But grief, when shared, becomes something else. He looked back at the letter, and for the first time in a decade, he felt something shift. Not a full healing, but the beginning of something softer. A thaw. Outside, a reporter's van drove past the building, slowing as it scanned the street. He sighed. What do I do now? Alice leaned back and said simply, whatever you need to, but maybe this time, don't do it alone. Later that afternoon, the Harrington Foundation posted a simple black and white photo on their website, a piano with a single sunflower laid across the keys. Below it, a single sentence. Sometimes the music finds its way home. And the world began to wait. Would he play again? Would he speak? Would he perform? Speculation swirled like snow in a storm. Every news outlet guessing, every social media thread buzzing. Some called it a resurrection, others a publicity stunt. But the people who had been there that day, the ones who had stood in silence while he played, knew better. They hadn't seen a ghost. They'd seen a man find the one place in the world where his pain could still speak, and for the first time in years, he had answered it with music. The morning Lucas stepped out of the hotel was gray. Not cold, not wet, just gray. The kind of overcast that dims even the sharpest edges of the city. He walked with his head lowered, hands in pockets, his coat buttoned tight as if to hold himself together. The world felt louder now, or maybe he had just grown used to silence. The streets buzzed with anticipation, news vans with satellites perched like vultures dotted the block. Reporters leaned on barricades with notepads and cameras, scanning every passing face. Most were young, eager. Some were rehearsing their questions under their breath. Others were live streaming, their voices pitched for urgency. Lucas kept walking. He passed a mural of his former conservatory, now just a long, sad wall with a painted fire consuming the piano. A child's drawing had been taped to it, a stick figure man playing keys while golden notes floated upward like prayers. At the corner of 8th and Sullivan, he turned left, slipping through an alleyway behind the bookstore, where he and Mira once browsed first editions on rainy Saturdays. Her laugh still echoed in that space, faint as perfume. He didn't notice the shadow following him until a voice called out, soft and hesitant. Mr. Harrington? He turned slowly. The man approaching was tall, well-dressed, early 40s perhaps. He carried himself with the confidence of someone used to closing deals, but tempered now by a cautious deference. I'm sorry to interrupt, truly, the man said, breathless, hands raised in apology. I've been trying to reach you privately. My name is Miles Rayner. I'm the executive director of the New York Philharmonic. Lucas raised an eyebrow. That's a long way from here. I flew in last night. I'm not performing, Lucas said gently, already starting to turn away. But Miles stepped forward, urgency crackling in his voice. You don't have to. Just listen, please. Lucas paused. Miles drew in a breath. Your video, what you played, it moved the world. And I don't say that lightly. I've had musicians and composers and complete strangers calling us in tears. That kind of response, it's generational. It's once in a lifetime. I've never seen anything like it. Lucas didn't speak. Miles pressed on. We're hosting a tribute concert. One night only, at the hall, a night of healing. Every dollar raised goes toward rebuilding the Harrington Conservatory. Lucas's eyes flickered. You think a concert can fix what's gone? No, Miles said without hesitation. But I think it can remind people why it mattered in the first place. Silence stretched between them, long and uneasy. Lucas looked away, his voice low. That fire didn't just take a building, it took my wife. It took the only thing I ever wrote for. Miles nodded slowly. I know, and I don't ask this lightly, but maybe that's exactly why you're the one who has to remind us. Lucas closed his eyes. He could still feel the weight of Mira's hand in his. Still smell the ash in her hair when he pulled her from the wreckage too late. He had nothing left to give, not really. And yet, there was that little girl in the sun hat, the grieving widow in the marketplace, the man who said he hadn't cried in 20 years until that melody, and Mira's letter. Play again, not because you owe it to the world, but because I'll be listening. When he opened his eyes, the city looked softer somehow. Send the program to Alice, he said quietly. I'll think about it. Miles didn't smile. He nodded, as if he understood the weight of even that much. I will, thank you. Lucas continued down the alley, vanishing again into the blur of morning. Back in his hotel room, he found a parcel slid under the door. No sender. Inside, a photograph, weathered and cracked, of the first day of the conservatory's construction. He stood in the center of the frame, arms wrapped around Mira, her laughter frozen mid-sunlight. Around them, the skeleton of the building, rising like a promise. On the back of the photo, in an unfamiliar hand, someone had written, "What you built didn't burn, it lives in us." He sat for a long time with the photo resting on his knees. That night, Lucas stood before a mirror. He hadn't really looked at himself in years. The silver in his beard, the ache behind his eyes, the gentle curve in his shoulders from years bent over keys. He reached for his cufflinks, the ones Mira gave him on their wedding day, each one engraved with the first nurse note of her favorite song. As he slid them on, he thought, maybe just one more song. Just one. He turned out the light and left the room without locking the door behind him. The concert hall hadn't changed. Not really. The red velvet seats still rippled like a tide beneath the golden balconies. The chandeliers still hovered like stars that had dropped just low enough to listen. The stage still wore its hush like a sacred garment. Thick, reverent, unshakable. But Lucas Harrington had changed. He stood alone in the wings, the black of his suit absorbing the shadows that stretched long across the polished wooden floor. Beyond the curtain, the sound of nearly 2,000 hearts waiting in breathless anticipation throbbed like distant thunder. He could hear it. The murmurs, the buzz, the faint echo of programs being folded, unfolded, folded again, the occasional cleared throat. But most of all, he could feel the weight of their expectations pressing against the very air. He hadn't been here in over 10 years. Not since the night he had conducted Mira's final student recital. Not since hours later when the fire consumed it all. Her, the conservatory, the music that never made it to the page. His fingers twitched at his sides, as though remembering keys they hadn't touched since that market afternoon. Since that melody found its way through him, despite him, like a river carving itself through grief. A soft voice interrupted his thoughts. "They're ready for you, sir." He turned. A young stage manager stood by the curtain rope, headset clamped around his ear, eyes wide with a mix of awe and terror, like he'd just been asked to usher a ghost into the land of the living. Lucas nodded once. "Thank you." The boy hesitated. I just wanted to say what you played at the market. It changed something in me. I didn't even know I liked classical music. But that day, I felt like it was mine." Lucas looked at him, quiet for a moment. It always was. Then the curtain rose and the hall fell into stillness. Lucas stepped out. The lights were hot, blinding, even through his tinted lenses. But he kept walking. The applause didn't come, not at first. People didn't know if they were supposed to cheer or pray. What he had become to them wasn't just a man or a musician. He was a myth, a wound reopened, a question answered and unanswered in the same breath. When he reached the bench, he stood for a moment in front of the Steinway. New, pristine, humming with potential. And then slowly, he turned toward the crowd. There, in the third row, sat Alice. Beside her, David's widow, the woman who'd recognized the melody that day at the market, her hands clutching the same bouquet of white chrysanthemums. Behind them, rows of strangers, some in suits, some in scarves. Some with tears already falling before the first note had even been played. And then, her. Not Mira, of course, but a young girl, maybe 19 or 20, with the same mahogany eyes and gentle tilt of chin. A conservatory student, no doubt. And in her lap, a program. He had refused to have his name printed on it. No photo, no fanfare, just one line. Tonight's performance, a song that was never finished. He turned back toward the piano, lowered himself onto the bench. His hands hovered just above the keys and paused. The silence in the room was no longer anticipation. It was reverence. He closed his eyes. He didn't plan the first note. He let it find him. And when it did, it wasn't the song from the market. Not exactly. That one had belonged to Mira. To grief. This one was different. It began soft, almost afraid, like a memory gently knocking on a door. Then it unfolded, measured, precise, but aching with vulnerability. Each note was a footstep through time, through rooms he had locked, through echoes he had refused to follow. The melody told the story of absence, of how something can be taken and still leave fingerprints. It rose slowly to something mournful, then paused, letting the crowd breathe. Then came the second movement. He leaned into it now. The music shifted, not quite hopeful, not yet triumphant, but searching, reaching, like a hand in the dark trying to find something it had once held. The keys beneath his fingers no longer felt cold. They felt alive, and with each bar, each phrase, the room moved with him. Tears fell silently down cheeks, hands clutched programs, couples reached for each other without speaking. By the time the final movement arrived, Lucas no longer felt like he was alone. The stage had become a bridge, and they had all walked across it. He played the ending gently, a decrescendo of memory, a whisper of forgiveness. And just before the last note, a chord suspended in silence, he opened his eyes. In the light, the girl with Mira's eyes smiled through her tears, and Lucas Harrington smiled back. Then he played the final note. It was not loud, it was not grand, but it was enough. The moment it ended, no one moved, no one clapped, not yet. They simply sat, bathed in the hush of something sacred. Then slowly, as if awakening from a shared dream, hands began to rise. The applause was not thunderous, it was grateful, a standing ovation born not from spectacle, but from something deeper. From having witnessed a man come home to himself. Lucas stood, bowed once, and left the stage without a word. Backstage, as the door closed behind him, he let the tears fall freely, not from grief, but from release. And somewhere, in the quietest corner of his soul, he felt Mira's hand slip into his again. The letter arrived on cream-colored cardstock, hand-delivered in a sealed envelope without a return address. Lucas found it beneath his breakfast plate the morning after the concert, at a quiet corner table in a hotel dining room where no one dared approach, but everyone looked. He turned it over once. No name, only a single line across the front, "We heard your silence." Inside was an invitation, not to another performance or a gala or an award ceremony, but to a warehouse in the South Bronx. Lucas stared at it for a long time. By noon, he was standing in front of the building. The brick was old, faded to a ruddy brown. Ivy climbed along one side, stubborn and defiant. The only indication he was in the right place was a mural painted across the corrugated steel door. A piano exploding into wildflowers, its keys turning into wings. He stepped inside and froze. It wasn't a warehouse. Not anymore. It was a sanctuary. Rows of upright pianos, each with a child seated at the bench, some barely tall enough to see the keys. Scuffed violins hanging from hooks on wooden beams. Drum sets patched with duct tape. Guitars missing strings but played with joy anyway. There was laughter, loud, beautiful, imperfect laughter. And beneath it, the rising thrum of music being born. Lucas took one step forward, then another. A woman noticed him and approached. She wore jeans flecked with paint, a scarf wound messily around her neck, and eyes that had seen hard years, but never given up. "You really came," she said, almost breathless. "I wasn't sure you would." "I almost didn't." She nodded like she understood. "Grief has its own calendar. We don't get to control the page turns." Lucas tilted his head. "What is this place?" "We call it the Unheard." She smiled gently. "Started with a few students who couldn't afford lessons, then a few more. Then someone donated an old drum kit and a neighbor gave up their garage. We grew, word spread." He looked around. "These instruments, they're broken," she said, "but not useless, kind of like the rest of us." Lucas let out a breath that felt like a laugh that hadn't learned how yet. The woman reached into her bag and pulled out a well-worn folder. Inside were sheets of music, compositions scrawled by students who didn't know rules, only feeling. "We watched your concert," she said. "Every one of us. We streamed it on a projector against the east wall. And when you finished, the room didn't move. Not for minutes." Lucas opened one of the pages. The notes were uneven, raw, but they pulsed with heart. "You gave them permission," she continued, voice soft, "to believe that pain could still become something beautiful. You reminded them they don't have to be famous to be heard. They just have to keep playing." He swallowed the ache rising in his throat. "They think you're magic," she added. "I'm not," he whispered. "No," she said. "You're more dangerous than magic. You're proof that people come back." He looked up at her, and something settled behind his ribs. A kind of gravity, a reason. She smiled again. "We don't need your name or your fame, but if you ever want to teach, the bench is yours." He left without promising anything. But the next morning, he returned with coffee and a new folder of sheet music. By the end of the week, he was showing two boys how to harmonize without stepping on each other's chords. By the end of the month, he had rewritten the melody he played at the market as a four-hand duet for a blind girl and her brother who tapped the rhythm with a pencil on the bench. Word spread. The conservatory board offered to name the rebuilt auditorium after Mira. Lucas agreed on one condition: no marble statue, no gold plaque, just a piano, unrestored. Just as it had been the day he sat down in the marketplace and played his heart open. The mayor came to visit the unheard. So did reporters. Foundations reached out with checks. Lucas stayed in the background. He didn't want applause. He wanted stories. He collected them, like the boy who built a drum set out of old soup cans and now led the best rhythm section in the city. Like the girl who hummed to calm her stutter and now wrote ballads that left grown men in tears. Each of them carried something broken. Each of them turned it into music. He taught them how to listen, to pauses, to silence, to the spaces between notes where truth lives. But they taught him something far greater, that healing wasn't always a crescendo. Sometimes it was one small chord, played over and over again, until you believed it. The envelope arrived in the last week of October. No courier, no signature, just pale blue parchment with a faint watermark in the corner. Conservatoire de Paris. Lucas turned it over slowly. His fingertips brushed the edge, hesitant. France. Mira had once studied there, years before they met. She used to talk about it as if it had been a dream she barely dared believe she'd lived. Narrow hallways filled with the smell of varnish and old paper. Late-night sonatas played with cold fingers. The thrill of discovering you were not alone in the world because someone else loved the same impossible sound. He hadn't thought of that place in years. Not since the funeral. Not since he buried all the pieces of her that the fire didn't take. And yet, the envelope was unmistakably hers. The handwriting on the back was familiar, delicate, slanted. It wasn't Mira's, but it was someone who had once known her well. Inside was a letter. It began simply. Dear Mr. Harrington, forgive the suddenness. I am a professor here in Paris, teaching harmony and composition. Years ago, your late wife was a guest lecturer. She spoke to my class about melody and memory and how a theme could haunt a composer until they found its home. Lucas paused. He could see her in his mind's eye, standing in front of that class, eyes alight, hands dancing through invisible chords in the air. At the time, she gave me a manuscript, a single movement of a piece she said she wasn't ready to finish yet. She asked me to hold on to it. If anything ever happens, she said, send it to Lucas. He'll know what to do. Lucas's breath hitched. I did not know what had happened to her until the night of your concert was streamed. I watched you play. I recognized the phrasing. I knew then that she had found her home in you and in the notes you carried for her. I am returning her unfinished piece to you, as she requested. Whatever you choose to do with it, let it be hers, and yours, and no one else's. Inside the envelope was a second, folded page. Thinner, yellowing at the edges, Mira's handwriting. It was titled only, For the Day He Returns. Lucas didn't move for a long time. The world outside his window shifted. School bells rang in the distance. A plane traced a silver thread across the sky. Someone on the sidewalk below shouted a greeting to a friend. But none of it reached him. His eyes remained locked on the page, her notes. They began where his ended, like a conversation that had waited in silence for 10 years. When he placed the page on the stand of his upright piano, the manuscript trembled in the air-conditioned draft, as if eager, as if alive. He placed his fingers on the keys and began. It wasn't perfect, not at first. His hands were rusty, his heart tender. But the melody unfolded with clarity, like something Mira had whispered into the pages just days before she died. It was different from the piece he had played at the market. This one wasn't about grief, it was about return, about coming back, not as the man who had lost, but as the man who had survived. The theme was delicate, like a sunrise trying not to wake the world too fast. It moved with grace, with breath, with joy that didn't deny sorrow, but held it gently. Lucas stopped halfway through, not because he forgot the notes, but because he couldn't see them through his tears. He pressed his palms against his face and cried, openly, fully, for the first time in years. Not just for Mira. Not just for the time lost. but for the strange, sacred beauty of being found again. Later that night, he walked to the unheard. The children were gone, the lights low, but the room was still warm with memory. He placed Mira's manuscript on the wall beneath a frame of her photo. No plaque, no signature, just the words, "Let it finish itself in others." That week he shared the composition with a young prodigy, Dahlia, the girl with the bruised fingers and eyes that saw more than she spoke. She played it 3 times, each time differently, and Lucas understood. The piece was never meant to be finished. It was meant to be passed on. He recorded it once, just once, in the back room of the studio. No audience, no spotlight. He titled it, simply, Mira's Return. The file was never uploaded. Instead, it was saved to a flash drive, wrapped in velvet, and sent to the Conservatoire de Paris, addressed to the professor who had kept Mira's trust. Lucas wrote only one line in the accompanying note: "Thank you for keeping her voice alive until I could hear it again." The reply came weeks later, a photo. A student recital in Paris, where a group of young composers had performed Mira's Return in 12 variations, each one inspired by different cities, lives, languages. They had cried, they had danced, they had found themselves in her melody. Lucas smiled and placed the photo beside the piano at the unheard. The keys glowed in the amber morning light, and for the first time in a long, long time he didn't feel alone. They called it a Lifetime Achievement Award. Lucas hadn't asked for it. He hadn't attended the rehearsals. He hadn't agreed to the tribute video. He had politely declined the formal tuxedo they tried to send to his door. But he showed up, only because Alice had asked. Because she said, with tears trembling in her voice, Mira would have wanted this part too. And so, one cool evening in mid-November, Lucas found himself sitting in the front row of the Grand Civic Auditorium, beneath cascading lights and polished gold balconies, watching the world pay homage to a man he no longer recognized in the photographs on the screen. Behind him, the orchestra swelled into the same aching theme he had once played with trembling hands in a dusty market square. The strings followed his phrasing. The woodwinds echoed his silence. The piano was played by a girl with trembling fingers and a steel spine. The audience wept. When the final note faded, they rose to their feet. The standing ovation was thunderous. But Lucas did not stand. He remained seated for a long, aching breath before slowly climbing the stairs toward the podium. His movements were unhurried, his eyes calm, his mouth set in a quiet line, not resistant but resolved. When he reached the microphone, the room hushed. The world leaned in. He looked down at the script placed beside the glass of water. Someone had written his biography in cursive gold print. Someone had written a speech for him. He pushed it aside, and then he spoke. His voice was soft, not shaky, just gentle, like a confession whispered at the edge of sleep. "I was once asked what music is, and I said, it's the sound of remembering." He looked out over the sea of faces, politicians, celebrities, philanthropists, students, survivors. But somewhere along the way we stopped listening to the ones who remember quietly, the ones without money, without name, without access. His voice didn't rise, but the truth in it did. There are children in this city who will never see a piano outside a cracked iPad screen. There are veterans who hold symphonies in their souls and sleep on sidewalks. There are elderly women who hum unfinished lullabies in memory care wards, and no one ever writes them down. A hush settled deeper. We spend millions on monuments, but not a penny for the music teacher down the hall. We name concert halls after donors and forget the janitor who sings to stay awake through his night shift. He let that sit. Then, with a quiet firmness, "I accept this award, not for what I've played, but for what I failed to hear." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded paper, held it up. "This is a list of 127 youth music programs that have been denied funding this year." He laid it on the podium. Not because they weren't worthy, but because they weren't loud enough. A few gasps in the audience. But Lucas wasn't finished. "I am donating this award and the full cash prize to the unheard, a place where broken instruments make unbroken children." Applause began, but then he added, "And I'm matching that amount 10 times over, anonymously, until now." The applause turned into thunder. Lucas waited, then leaned closer to the microphone, his voice almost breaking. "Mira used to say music is what the soul uses when words run out. I've spent years silent because I thought I had nothing left to say." He looked to the side of the stage where her portrait hung. "I was wrong." He stepped back from the podium, and for one beautiful suspended moment, before the orchestra struck up again, before the lights changed, before the next speech began, the entire hall was still. Not because he had finished speaking, but because, somehow, it felt like Mira had spoken through him. Later that night, after the ceremony, Lucas returned to his hotel room alone. Not lonely, just alone, the way a page waits before the first note is written. The velvet award box lay unopened on the dresser. Instead, he pulled out a small leather notebook, and on its first blank page he wrote, "Music is not the echo of greatness. It is the echo of someone trying to live, to forgive, to come home." He set down the pen and stared at the piano by the window. It was time to begin again. The sun rose slowly over the East River, casting honeyed light across rooftops slick with dew. Down in the heart of the city, just as the streets began to breathe and the storefronts unlocked their cages, a quiet invitation began to ripple through inboxes, whispers, and word of mouth. There was to be one more performance. No cameras, no red carpet, no program, no fanfare, just a piano, one man, one night. It would take place where the story began. The market square, by the old wall with the mural, where the chipped uprights still stood, restored only in spirit, not in polish. Its keys still stuck slightly, its legs still bowed from weather and weight. But the sound it held, timeless. Lucas arrived just before sunset. He wore no tuxedo, no press badge, no tailored spotlight, just his navy coat and a folded envelope in his breast pocket. The note inside read, "You always thought the song ended with me, but love doesn't work like that. Keep playing, there's more." By the time he sat at the bench, the crowd had gathered in silence. Children pressed close, their cheeks flushed pink with cold. Elderly couples held hands. Street performers had tucked away their guitars, their amplifiers. Vendors had dimmed their stall lights. Someone passed out candles. No one spoke. Lucas adjusted the bench slowly, fingers brushing against the worn keys like reacquainting with an old friend. His eyes didn't search for anyone in the crowd. He didn't need to. He knew who was there. The girl with the sunflower hairpin, the violinist from the corner, Alice standing quietly behind a row of folding chairs, and somewhere in the back, near the alley he'd once vanished into, Delia, the prodigy, the girl who now played better than he ever had. He looked down at the keys and began. The first note floated out like breath on glass, tender, unsure. It trembled for a moment, and then found its strength. He did not play one of his own compositions, he played theirs. Theirs. The melody Mira never finished. The piece he passed to Dahlia, to the students of the unheard, to the children of Paris, to every orphaned note that had ever searched for a home. Only now, it was complete. And it was no longer his. It belonged to everyone who had ever sat in silence and ached to be understood. The music rose slowly but without apology. It bent beneath grief, then soared into something close to joy. It remembered, without regret. It reached without trembling. The refrain was soft, but rooted like an oak. It echoed off brick and glass. It pulsed through the soles of feet. People didn't just cry. They held each other. They remembered their own unfinished songs. And when Lucas reached the final bar, he paused, then stood. He turned to the crowd and raised his hand. From the edge of the circle, Dahlia stepped forward. She was shaking slightly, not from fear, but from knowing. She took her place at the bench, and Lucas walked away. No encore, no bow. Just the sound of new hands playing an old hope. The melody didn't stop, it changed. It became younger, wiser, braver. Lucas stood in the shadows now, behind the crowd. He listened, he let go. Later, someone would ask him why he didn't stay, why he didn't claim the final applause. He would smile and say, because the story was never mine to end. 3 months later, a new music center would open at the edge of the market square. Its name, The Bench. Built not in marble, but in reclaimed wood. Inside, the original piano sat beneath a skylight, its keys polished but unchanged. Children would gather around it every Saturday to write songs, argue over tempo, and stumble through joy. The plaque beside it read, "This piano once silenced a marketplace. Now it sings for everyone. LH and MH." And every year on the night of the first snowfall, they would hold a candlelit concert. No tickets, no cameras, just stories, just sound, just the music of people returning to themselves. Because in the end, Lucas Harrington hadn't come back to reclaim a legacy. He came back to give it away. One note at a time. To anyone still listening, and everyone still waiting to be heard. Some stories don't end with applause. They end with a single note passed gently from one trembling hand to another. Lucas Harrington's journey wasn't about reclaiming fame. It was about reclaiming voice. His silence wasn't weakness. It was the echo of loss, of love, of memory unfinished. But when he sat at that broken piano in a forgotten marketplace, he reminded us of something vital. That even in ruins, beauty waits. That grief doesn't silence us forever. It shapes the music we were always meant to play. This story teaches us that healing rarely comes in grand gestures. Sometimes it arrives in quiet moments, unfinished melodies, handwritten letters, or the eyes of a child who believes again. We are not defined by what the world forgets, but by what we choose to remember and pass on. You don't need a stage to matter. You don't need perfection to be heard. You just need the courage to sit at the bench and begin. And maybe, just maybe, someone else will hear their own story in your song. Because the most powerful legacy is the music we leave behind in others.